Hey, everybody, and welcome to our lecture this week, which is on assessment and goal setting. So, we're going to talk about these as kind of two distinct topics, although they are very kind of connected and interrelated. We will talk about them as assessment, as a particular set of techniques and skills and concepts, and then goals as another set of skills and concepts. But obviously, this in the actual counseling process, these things kind of flow together a lot more organically than we're going to be talking about them in terms of different concepts here in the presentation. So let's get going. All right. So why are we talking about assessment here, and as part of the counseling process, and as a kind of a set of techniques and skills that we need as counselors? The first reason is kind of an initial assessment helps us understand what's going on and if the counseling process is appropriate to help the client with what they need, right? And so a good assessment process at the beginning of a counseling relationship or at the onset of a client initiating contact, whether that be in a school system or in a clinical setting. Assessment just really helps us get an understanding of what's happening in the moment and what is going to be the most appropriate means for helping the client. Because sometimes, depending on what the assessment results show, it may be something we can help the client with. It may be something that, we can help a client with a piece of what they're struggling with, and maybe we need to help them connect with some other kind of secondary services to deal with pieces of the problem. Or it may just be that the client's presenting issue is not really something that we as counselors can work with or can handle. And so assessment is really critical at that kind of a triage level of understanding what the client's needs and how they're going to have those met. It does provide data for the goal setting process. So that's where one of the connection is between these two topics, is that assessment's how we get the data to formulate with our clients what the goals might be for the process. It does help us develop an understanding of the problem. It helps the client further their understanding of the problem. A good assessment process helps the client think about their presenting challenge, whatever that is, from a very kind of holistic way. And so, the clients are generally familiar with kind of what the work is and that kind of thing. But a lot of times they haven't thought through the details of it. And so a good assessment process can kind of guide folks through that process of really looking at whatever their problem is, looking at it from some different angles and thinking about it a little differently. It does begin to help us understand the individual. And so not only kind of the problem that they're struggling with, but getting to know the person and kind of viewing them holistically. We don't work with problems, we work with people. And this assessment process can help us begin to understand the individual as well as kind of what they're working on or wanting to work on. It does uncover strengths, so it's not necessarily just a deficit focused process. We're not just assessing the problem and the challenges that clients have, but we are beginning to form an understanding of what characteristics or what experiences do the client possess that are going to help them deal with this presenting issue, whatever that may be. So it uncovers the strengths. And then it also helps us determine what techniques might be helpful. So based on the presenting problem, is it an awareness driven problem? Are we going to be using a lot of reflecting techniques to help the client become more aware? And are those reflecting techniques going to be in a particular direction, whether it be emotions or meaning or thought processes? And so this is, assessment really is the beginning of helping us form an understanding of where the client is, who they are, what they're struggling with, and then how we might help them. All right. So how do we assess? We're going to talk about both informal and formal assessment strategies. So informal assessment is something we're doing all the time with our clients. And so this, we think about informal assessments as kind of it's not a formalized assessment in terms of like, we're going to sit down and do this assessment. It is an informal way, a more unstructured way compared to formal assessments to gather information. And so a lot of that is observational. Again, these are things that we do very naturally, and we've already talked a little bit about them in this class with nonverbal communication, but we're assessing a client's speech. That could be the tone of their voice, the pace of their speech, those kinds of things. Do they talk very flatly? Do they kind of very wildly in their tone of voice or their volume or their pace of speech. Those are all kind of clinical things we want to be assessing. How do they present themselves? So clothing or grooming. Clothing we think about, is it congruent with the setting and the weather, right? So if you got a client who comes in a down jacket and it's 95 degrees outside, that's clinically relevant information. Grooming, a basic hygiene, is it taking place? Is it, is it problematic? Is a client's level of challenge or impairment with whatever they are struggling with to a point to where they are unable to keep up their basic hygiene? Posture, build, and gait. That can be helpful, especially over the long run, understanding patterns in any of these. So if a client, if you've been working with someone for, I don't know, a few weeks, and all of a sudden you see a dramatic change in how they carry themselves, or maybe they're losing weight, pretty rapidly, or gaining weight pretty rapidly, or they're not grooming themselves well when they were before. Any of those kind of changes. That's why we're paying attention to this stuff. We're using it as data points to understand the client, but also to understand the trajectory of treatment. And is a client, are any of their observable data points changing over time? Can be really helpful. Facial expressions, we've talked about those before. And then, any kind of reactions to the client. Do you feel, I don't know, unsafe with the client, or uneasy around the client? Do they make you anxious? And understanding what that is about. That could be a countertransference, something that we're bringing into the session, but it could also be something that the client is, doing in session that is making us feel this way. So there may be something observable there that we want to assess and just pay attention to. Questioning is another informal assessment technique, and it's one that comes, pretty natural to most of us. But during the assessment stage of a counseling process, when we're trying to get to know the client and their presenting issue, we are going to ask more questions than we might in other stages of the counseling process. So just know that it is a little heavier. That doesn't mean we should only be asking questions. We still need to, vary our techniques and use reflections as well. But we may ask more questions in the assessment phase. It lets us gather information. It does help the client think about their presenting issue in different ways, and it can help identify and explore, kind of in a very targeted way, a specific problem. So those are some of the informal assessment techniques that we use. Excuse me. On the formal assessment side, what we're talking about here is a more formal, it doesn't have to be super formal, but a more kind of structured assessment metric, or instrument. And so they are typically either going to be structured or semi-structured. And you'll talk about this in the eval and assessment class. You'll get into kind of what the details of what that means. But typically a structured assessment is an assessment that we are going to give the client that has been studied. So it's been kind of empirically validated and shown to be reliable. It measures what it's going to, what it's supposed to measure. And typically when you give that kind of structured assessment, you follow the directions. You don't really kind of veer off of what the assessment says to do. And so that's what we call kind of a structured assessment. A semi-structured assessment is one that it meets all those other criteria in terms of it being empirically valid and reliable, but it also allows for some leeway of going kind of off script. And so that's where the semi-structured piece comes in. So you have some structured questions that you might be asking, and then there's this room for non-structured dialogue. And so if a client says something and you want to ask a follow-up question or you want to get some clarification, a semi-structured assessment allows that flexibility of you got the structured piece of the assessment, but there's also these areas where you can kind of go off script and get more information based on the context of how the client's answering. So intakes are a very common form of formal assessment. So on the clinical side of things, you're probably almost always going to have an intake process that can look very different based on where you're at, the setting you're working in, and the populations you're working with. But it's generally going to get the bullet points on here. I'm not going to read them out, but you're trying to get kind of a holistic picture here of what's going on for the client in a lot of different areas of their life. So you can begin forming an understanding of what might be contributing to the client's presenting issue. In a school setting, you might not have probably not going to have a formal intake process, but that doesn't mean you're not going to get a lot of this data in other ways. And so you may be able to access a client's record to look at things like, family history or developmental issues. Some of this may be coming from the client or the student themselves in terms of the affective, behavioral, cognitive symptoms. A teacher may be giving you information, a parent. So, the information is still there, even though it may not be in kind of this formal assessment process that it may be in a clinical setting. You're still getting very similar information. And so some common formal assessment instruments are listed here. Excuse me, I'm about to cough real quick. Oh, sorry about that. So two of the most common formal assessment instruments, and these are kind of general formal assessment measures, or instruments, meaning that they assess multiple symptom areas, excuse me. So something like the Beck Depression Inventory, which is another common assessment instrument, is very targeted towards depression, right? Whereas the MMSE, Mini Mental Status Examination, and the PQH9, I think that's PHQ9, I think that's a typo, Patient Health Questionnaire 9, are meant to gather information on multiple symptoms, and they can be really helpful to begin kind of formally gauging where a client might be struggling. Are they showing signs of depression or anxiety on one of these formal measures? And then that can lead to some more targeted follow-up questions around those experiences the client's having. All right. So we do want to pull assessment data together. We're not gathering assessment information to look at it in isolation. Even when we do a formal assessment, we are just looking at those data points kind of in aggregate. We're kind of pulling everything together and say, what is this? When we look at all the data together, what does it tell us? So that does, paint a holistic picture for the client and what they're going through. It informs our diagnosis. So, there may be kind of different data points that are coming together to tell us what a client might fit diagnosis wise. It does help distill sporadic information. Sometimes it can feel like with certain clients, it can feel like you cover so much ground in such a short period of time that it can be hard to kind of like, how do we bring all this together? And so, thinking about it from an assessment standpoint, you're looking for connections or overlap between data points that clearly connects with each other. So, a client has had a major life change, maybe at home. Say you're working with a kid or an adolescent, and their parents have recently divorced, and now you're seeing behavioral issues in school, right? And so those are two separate data points, two areas of life. We're talking about home life, parents split up, and we're talking about school life where the behavioral issues are showing up in the classroom. Those can seem like two disparate pieces of data, but part of the assessment process is bring the stuff together to say how might these be connected. It's not a definitive, this is causing this. It's not a causal thing, but it's you are beginning to form hypotheses around what data might be connected with each other. And doing that, kind of bringing all these pieces of data together, really does help us and help the client develop a kind of a target in terms of like, what is it that we're trying to work on? So, a client may come in and there's just so many challenges or problems in their life that they're dealing with. And we can look for and work with the client to figure out like either prioritizing the challenges or problems, like what is most important to work on right now, or we might even look for kind of underlying things like maybe a client's whatever, like feeling of self-worth or emotional dysregulation. I'm trying to think of things that, these are examples of things that might be kind of an underlying thing that we may work on that are actually causing problems in different areas of a client's life. So as opposed to working on something very specific like emotional regulation in the classroom or emotional regulation at the workplace, we might work on kind of emotional dysregulation or emotional regulation at a broad level, and understanding that that work will then kind of tie into these different contextual pieces of a client's life. So that is, that can be helpful in terms of figuring out kind of what's the primary thing we're going to begin working on here. So again, that ties into goals, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And it helps the client prioritize the work that they want to do. And this is, a co-constructed process. We're not coming up with the work that the client is going to do. It is a process where we are working with the client to kind of connect these dots and see if there's relevant connections there between these data points that a client is presenting to us. So it is a co-constructed, kind of very collaborative process. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is goals. And so we have talked about assessment and kind of, getting the data, pulling it together, which informs this process, which is setting goals in the counseling process, which is really critical. We want to make sure that our work has a focus to it, that we have a clear direction that we are working in. That doesn't mean it can't change. It is very flexible just in terms of what a client needs. But we do want to make sure that we have some intent, right? Like a clear idea of what it is we're trying to work on, where we're working towards. And so that's that's why goals are really critical to the counseling process. It does break down the problem into manageable units. So we know that clients who see kind of small changes at the beginning of a counseling process are much more likely to stick with the counseling process. They become more invested in it. It builds up the hope that they can change because they're seeing those small level changes happening pretty quickly. It does bring that focus to the therapeutic work so that you're not just kind of all over the place and talking about a different thing every week. And it does give us some kind of focal point to say, how's this working? Like, how's the counseling process working? And how is the work that a client is doing outside of the counseling relationship working for them? So, for all those reasons, goals are really critical. All right, so excuse me, all goals should be client driven, meaning we're not coming up with these for the client, that they are coming up with their goals themselves or in collaboration with us. And so they should be specific and concrete. So don't use something like client will feel better as a goal. I mean, obviously that's a goal, but we need to be really specific. We know that clear goals in the counseling process lead to better progress and outcomes. There's lots of research to back this up. So if you're working with a client and what you're working on is kind of ambiguous to both you and the client, then it's going to be hard to see the progress because you don't really have anything to measure. If you're not really sure what does improvement look like in this situation, there's no kind of point of reference for the work that's being done. So always want to have clear goals. It's better if we can state them positively. So this is a little kind of vocabulary trickery. So as an example, to say if you have a client who is anxious and you are working on lowering the anxiety, what you would not say, kind of a negatively stated problem would be client will experience less anxiety in, dot, 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 social situations. Um, a positively stated problem, client will feel more calm in social situations. So it's like, it's the same problem, it's just the flip side of the coin. And what you're doing is you're stating the problem in a positive way, and you're kind of making the problem a goal. So it's the exact same thing, but there's some evidence that stating it positively, you're emphasizing the pieces that a client wants, which yes is less anxiety, but it is also more calm. And so what are we trying to acquire as opposed to what are we trying to diminish or reduce? So, stating things on the positive side has been shown to be helpful in terms of goals. Goals definitely need to be measurable. So we need to know, how the client is making progress or if they're making progress. We got to be able to have some kind of definitive uh, way of measuring the counseling process. So that could be, you symptoms that clients are experiencing. It could be behaviors tied to symptoms that a client's experiencing, but it needs to be, excuse me, measurable somehow. It also needs to be observable. And so, for that reason, most goals are going to be behaviorally stated. Even if you're not doing behavioral therapy, you are going to have goals that are behaviorally stated because, if you think about kind of that, the depth of awareness and chart, and then kind of Lazarus's model that we looked at several weeks ago, which basically is looking at kind of the upper levels of awareness and the outer rims of Lazarus's model. We're looking for like the safe, observable, anybody can see it, easily accessible data points, right? And those are generally behaviors, right? So that is why observation can be really helpful when we're thinking about goals, is making sure that it's something we can see or other people can see, so we can have that easy data point moving forward with the goals. All right, here's just a few examples of goal setting questions. The first one is called the miracle question. You may have seen this. It is closely associated with motivational interviewing, MI. So if you're familiar with motivational interviewing, this may seem familiar, but basically ask if a miracle happened, what would be different tomorrow? Excuse me. Another version that is, you state that you and your partner argue constantly. What would you rather be doing? So you're not asking like, what's your goal here? But you're essentially saying, what's your goal here? You're just asking it in a different way. What would you rather be doing, or what would life look like if it were the way you wanted it to be? And so that's what that third question there, third example of a goal setting question is that the problem was solved, what would be different? What would you be doing, thinking, feeling? Basically just getting the client to imagine, if this works, what is the outcome going to be? Because that's the goal you're setting. All right, so this is, I think this is the last slide in the presentation, but it basically breaks down, how do we take all this information we have about a client that we've gathered from our assessment and boil it down to a problem, or, presenting issue, however you want to term it, that we're going to be working on. So the first step is to just make sure you're on the same page with the client. So summarizing, agreeing on whatever that presenting problem, presenting issue is step number one. Want to make sure we're on the same page. There's no point in doing the other steps if we're not like heading in the same direction in terms of what we're seeing and hearing. We don't want to ask the client to identify kind of the most crucial problem or changes. So, excuse me. Say they are wanting to increase their calm / reduce anxiety. Where would they like to see this first? What area of life would they see the most impact if they were able to see the progress that they want to see? And so getting even more specific, okay, we got a presenting issue. Here's the area of life where the client wants to see the change happen the most. And then we're selecting from that a very specific problem, kind of, one or two, like a client has to do public speaking for their job, but they get tremendous social anxiety, right? And so we're getting it even more narrow in terms of what is the problem and what's a specific goal that we can develop around that problem. And then, at the end, you're just kind of making sure that everybody's clear that this is what we're working on, right? And so this is really helpful to do, excuse me, to do at the beginning of a counseling process, because if you have a client who comes in, and I've had numerous clients like this, but they come in and there's almost always like a crisis of the week. There's something new has come up in their life. This goal is, I always think about goals as kind of anchors for the counseling process, because if you have a client like that, you have something to kind of check in with them on to say, I know this is happening this week, or this happened this week, and you want to process it, how is that connected, or is it connected to your goal for this process, the bigger piece of work? Because, like I say, we want to be flexible and meet a client's needs. Sometimes the work that a client has identified they want to do is really hard, and they may be intentionally or unintentionally distracting themselves from that work by, talking about something that happened this week that, yes, it was not fun or distressing, but maybe that's not really where their work is, or the bigger piece of work that they need to do. And so having that goal can be really helpful as an anchor to kind of say, we've spent a couple weeks talking about things other than what you said you wanted to work on. Let's get back to the work. Or do we need to recalibrate and set a different goal? Because that's fine too. This is the client's process. They get to set the goals, but we are kind of a checkpoint to say, you said you wanted to work on this, but our work hasn't really been working on that. Let's talk about that and see if we need what we need to do here. So for all those reasons, assessment and goal setting can be really helpful. So we'll do some work in class around this. But if you have any questions, feel free to post them in Google Classroom, and I'll make sure we get to them before we have class. All right, y'all. Thanks so much. Hope you have a good week. Bye.